Let's bring in the jury.
Please stand for the jury.
Sure. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
And ma'am, we left talking about the 3 scales of the MMPI on the clinical portion that you reviewed, correct?
Correct, the top 2 and 3.
And then you gave us, before lunch, you gave us your impression, not your impression, but your opinion about what those meant, right? Before we left. Are you familiar with the term floating profiles?
Yes.
And as it applies, does that have anything to do with the MMPI?
Yes.
What is that?
A floating profile is when you see that there are a number of elevations, such as I described earlier on the MMPI. When the vast majority of the clinical scales are elevated, again, that threshold is 65. When it's elevated above 65, it's called a floating profile.
And why is that significant in this case as it applies to the defendant?
A floating profile is commonly seen in individuals who have borderline personality disorder.
Right. You also indicated that you administered the WACE test. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Why did you administer the WACE?
When I first started reviewing the records, there was indication in those records that there was a sense of immaturity that was present. For example, in Ms. Arias' booking profile, the way that she took the picture, she kind of smiled as though it was a high school photo rather than a booking picture that you would typically see. This to me was strange. I found it to be strange and immature. There was also the things that happened surrounding that suggested that there was, again, some immaturity there, such as her parents had indicated that she was described as being happy as hell when they came to visit her in jail. There was behaviors like this that were aberrant, that were strange, and it made me wonder whether there was some sort of intellectual deficit there that could be contributing to this, which is why I gave the intelligence test.
And you were able to determine and find what you found, what you've already told us, correct?
Correct.
As a result of that, in the testing that you did you reach a diagnosis, or did you have an opinion at that point, or did you do more testing?
I conducted the 4 tests that we've already discussed.
And after that, did you have an opinion as to what the diagnosis was in this case?
After looking at that, taking in consideration her behavioral observations and all of the different pieces of information that I had, yes, I did.
And what was that?
I diagnosed her on Axis 2 as borderline personality disorder.
What does that mean?
Generally, borderline personality disorder, you can think of it similar to what we see in teenagers often. This sense of immaturity and what's called emotional lability, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But generally, it's about instability. There's unstable interpersonal relationships, unstable emotions, and an unstable sense of identity, meaning who am I as a person? There's this constant fluctuation. There's a lot of manipulation that's involved with people who have borderline personality disorder, and a large sense of immaturity. You can, again, think about a teenager.
One of the items that's been talked about is the DSM-4 and TR. Do you know what the DSM is?
Yes.
What is it?
It's a diagnostic and statistical manual, which is information that we use to conclude on diagnoses. It gives us specific symptoms that are present to suggest the presence of a psychological disorder.
Are you familiar why there is the TR version and what that means?
The TR version is the updated version of the DSM-4.
Is it the same thing as the DSM-4 or is it something different?
It's not completely different. They are similar. In terms of criteria for various disorders, the vast majority of the criteria stayed the same. What's different is the subsections of every disorder. For example, a subsection in there might be, how do you differentiate X disorder from Y disorder? What are the features that we look for that tell us that it's one versus the other? So that's an example of one of the sections that was updated, such as adding additional diagnoses that say, you know, these two disorders might be confused with one another. Here's something that you consider to differentiate.
One of the things that we've looked at with regard to post-traumatic stress disorder is that there was a number of sections and a number of characteristics under each of the sections. Is the same true for borderline personality disorder under the DSM-4?
It's not laid out exactly like PTSD in that there's just a list of symptoms rather than categories like it is with PTSD.
And but it does have some characteristics, though.
That's correct, symptoms.
Let me go ahead and have something marked. Are you familiar with Exhibit 622? You look at it.
Yes, this is a copy of the DSM.
And this is a copy of the DSM-4 involving what?
This is the DSM-4-TR involving the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder.
If I may have that back. Does it also include the diagnostic criteria?
Yes.
And do you know those off the top of your head, or will this refresh your recollection as to what the diagnostic criteria is?
I know them off the top of my head, but I think it would be helpful to have it.
Right? Go ahead and take a look at 622, and let me ask you about it. Once you reviewed it, what is the first criteria that DSM-4 lists for a finding or a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder?
It's called frantic efforts to avoid...
Without reading it. If you need to read it,
sure.
read it now.
I don't need to read it.
Okay. What's the first one? And
Efforts to avoid
Judge, may
real...
we have the overhead?
Efforts to avoid
Hold
real
on.
or imagined abandonment.
What is it again?
Efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment.
So that's the first one, efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, correct?
Correct.
And in this particular case, what did you find as it applied to that?
In the case of Miss Arias, I found that this was a symptom that was characteristic of her.
Why is that? Explain to me how you found that.
First, let me explain fears of abandonment. As humans, we don't want to be alone. That's part of human nature. What we find in people who have borderline personality disorder is that they have a very strong desire to be attached and to be close to people. They have a terrified feeling of being abandoned by others. So what we see when I'm looking for symptoms when I'm looking for signs of the symptom, I'm looking again for a pattern that has happened over time. In terms of this, what we see in people with borderline personality disorder is that they engage in behaviors to try to keep people close to them. But ironically, these kinds of behaviors often push people away. So in the case of Miss Arias, this was demonstrated throughout her relationship, throughout life, and also with Mr. Alexander. For example, after they broke up, when they broke off their relationship, she then moved to Mesa to be closer to him. I also interviewed his brother, Steve, and he indicated to me that Mr. Alexander...
Without telling us what he said, what characteristic did you find?
This fear of abandonment. This
Okay.
tendency to overstep boundaries, to be intrusive. Miss Arias herself notified me that she had checked his Facebook without his permission, read text messages without his permission, engaging in these kinds of behaviors of, don't leave me, let me see what you're doing, I want you to be near me. There was indication from friends that highlighted her tendency to engage in these intrusive behaviors, by spying on him, by being intrusive with his space in general.
Okay, and so did she meet this characteristic or this
Yes.
criteria? What is you need to take a look at the exhibit, what's the second criteria?
Unstable and intense interpersonal relationships.
What are we talking about there?
People with borderline personality disorder have a very difficult time maintaining what we would consider healthy interpersonal relationships. What they do is they have this tendency to split people, meaning that they have a tendency to either idealize them on one hand or devalue them and despise them. And what I mean by that, idealize means that they put this person up on a pedestal and nothing that they do, no matter what, they view them as being perfect. Whereas devalue and despise, no matter what they do, they dislike them, they're upset with them. And what we see with individuals with borderline personality disorder is that they tend to shift between these two types of interacting with people.
So give us some examples, if there are any, involving the defendant.
I did find that Ms. Arias met the symptom for borderline personality disorder. She had a very strong tendency to go from boyfriend to boyfriend, one after another, which is also another example of fear of abandonment that I just highlighted. What I found is in these relationships, there was a very strong tendency to idealize the men that she was with. For example, she had indicated to me that Mr. Alexander was not faithful to her during the relationship, but nonetheless, she still had this devout love for him. And you can see even within her journals, the way that she talks about her boyfriends and her partners in general, it has this very adolescent, immature, for lack of a better word, a saccharine kind of feel to it, a very strong, sweet, wanting to make them happy feel to it, doing anything possible, keeping them idealized despite what was going on in their relationship.
How about the next characteristic?
The next characteristic is identity disturbance.
What is that?
Again, I'd like to relate back to thinking of a teenager. When we're young, we all develop a sense of who we are as a person, and that can shift when we're younger. That can shift in many different ways. But what we find as we grow through adulthood, that becomes much more stable. We have a good sense of who we are as a person, what our beliefs are, how we engage with the world. It becomes relatively consistent. You have an idea of who you are. What we see in people with borderline personality disorder is that sense of identity is not there. It's not stable. It's changing. It tends to change depending on who's in their environment. And this is also a symptom that I found in Ms. Arias. You can see this in her tendency to join the Mormon church really quickly. You can also see this in the records when her ex-boyfriend, Daryl, was talking about her pattern of behaviors. He had indicated that at one point
Overruled, you may continue.
He had indicated that there was a point in which she had changed the color of her hair, bought a certain car, and acted a certain way to be consistent with his ex-wife. Again, this tendency to shift who she is. She had indicated to me that when she was with one boyfriend, she behaved one way, whereas with other boyfriends, she behaved a very different way, lived a very different lifestyle.
Give me an example of that.
For example, with her boyfriend, Matt, she had indicated that at one point they were living in a tent, versus when she was with Daryl, she attempted to be much more mature when she was around Daryl and professional when she was around Mr. Alexander. It's this constant shifting in who she is dependent on who's in her environment.
And how about the next characteristic?
Impulsivity.
What does that refer to?
The tendency to do things on a whim, to not be thoughtful about your actions and be impulsive. This is not a symptom characteristic that I found to be a stable characteristic in Ms. Arias.
So in other words, this is not something that you found on her part then?
Right, I do not believe she meets this symptom.
All right, how about the next one?
Suicidal behavior.
Did you say pseudo?
Suicidal
Oh, suicidal.
behavior and ideation.
I think that's self-explanatory. Tell us whether or not the defendant had any suicidal behavior and whether or not she had any ideation about that.
It's self-explanatory in some ways, in other ways it's not. You can see suicidal behavior in a number of different psychological disorders. The way in which it fits into the pattern that we see with borderline personality disorder is that, again, you're looking for a consistent pattern throughout life. I fortunately had access to Miss Arias's diary, and throughout her diary, beginning in 1995, there was consistent notations about the desire to not be alive, to engage in suicidal behavior, thoughts about it.
And so did she meet this criteria?
Yes, because there was that pattern, she did meet that criteria.
What's the next criteria?
It's called affective instability.
What is it, affective?
Affective instability.
And I did not hear the next words.
Instability.
Okay. What is this referring to?
The easiest way to think about this symptom is a roller coaster of emotions. Affective instability is when your emotions go up and down at a quick pace, unpredictably up and down. And this is often referred to when people show the symptom, most people will refer to it as the person has bipolar disorder, which is not an accurate representation of what bipolar disorder actually is, but it's just a quick shifting of emotions.
And does she meet this?
Yes, there was consistent evidence in the records of her tendency to go up and down. Several of her boyfriends described her, in fact, all of them, of the information that I have had access to, they all described her as having very quick shifting emotions, going from happy to mad to sad very quickly. And interestingly, I saw that myself within her journal entries. Within the same day, I could see a person who was very happy to shifting to be very upset, very sad, and within one day, very quickly.
Anything else under this section? Not this section, but the one involving the characteristics. Anything else?
Well, one more thing related to affective instability, again, because I am looking for a pattern of symptoms over time. There was indication that her parents had described this as being a consistent behavior for her since she was relatively young.
All right, next.
Chronic feelings of emptiness.
I'm sorry?
Feelings of emptiness.
And how many of these characteristics are laid out in the DSM-4?
How many symptoms?
Symptoms.
There's 9 symptoms.
And of the 9, how many must be met before this diagnosis is viable?
5.
Okay? Feelings of emptiness. Tell me about that.
We find that people who have borderline personality disorder tend to have this prolonged sense of just feeling empty, just feeling like there's nothing there, despite the fact that there's all this emotional turmoil that does go on inside. They have this sense of just being empty. And I specifically asked Miss Arias about that, who indicated that she's felt that way since adolescence, just this sense of emptiness.
Next, symptoms.
Inappropriate, intense anger.
Okay? What is that?
It's a tendency to engage in angry and aggressive behaviors. Again, we're looking for patterns of behavior.
And did you find anything in her writings where she admitted that she had this inappropriate, intense anger?
Yes, she identified it in an email to Mr. Alexander.
I'm going to show you an exhibit. Take a look at Exhibit 623, see if you recognize it.
Yes.
And what's the date of that email?
It's February 14th, 2007.
And who is it from?
It's from Miss Arias,
To whom?
Mr. Alexander.
And does it discuss her inappropriate, intense anger?
It does.
Move for the admission of Exhibit 623.
may continue.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. You indicated there was 9, I think, symptoms that indicated or that may be explored when deciding whether or not something is borderline personality disorder.
That's correct.
Can we? What's the 9th one?
Transient stress-related paranoid ideation.
Transient, stress-related.
Paranoid ideation.
What is that?
What that means is in times of extreme stress, we see high levels of paranoia.
And did you find this in this particular case?
No.
If we could just wait for the... Well, do you agree or disagree with Dr. Samuels that the defendant may be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder?
I disagree with that diagnosis.
Tell me why you disagree with that.
There wasn't symptoms that were consistent with that diagnosis.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
There were not symptoms that Ms. Arias displayed that would be consistent with that diagnosis.
All right, let's wait for that.
I'd also like to clarify another.
No, there's no question. Does it relate to what you have in front of you involving borderline personality disorder?
Yes.
Let me take a look at it. Which section are you referring to?
Referring to symptom number 2. I'd like to offer an example.
Pardon?
I'd like to offer an example so the court is more clear.
Sustained.
and this issue involving inappropriate, intense anger. What does it say? If you could read that out loud, please.
What part of it would you like me to read?
Pardon?
What part of it would you like me to read?
The second paragraph,
From the beginning.
beginning with however.
However, you already know the secret. I don't need to remind you, but you are so powerful and you can turn the situation around at any time. I found out, much to my regret, that my anger is very destructive.
Slow down a little bit. The court reporter's having a hard time.
Sorry.
Getting up with you.
I've never beaten up anybody over it, but I've kicked holes in the walls, kicked down doors, smashed windows, broken things. It hurts people, and it hurts me.
Keep going. The whole paragraph.
It lowers my vibration and attracts unwanted, lower vibrational situations and people into my life. So I strive every day to be the bigger person and be a living example and choose the right and see everything through a filter of love. But it doesn't always work that way. I mess up. Sometimes I forget who I am. But I will never stop striving to be Christ-like as much as I possibly can.
Is that part of the inappropriate, intense anger that you were talking about?
Yes, that's one example.
And this actually was written by the defendant, Exhibit 623, on what date?
That was on February 14th, 2007,
At what time?
1658.
And 1658 is what time in 24 hours? Do you know what that
I
is?
would assume it's 4 o'clock.
Well, wouldn't it be 4:58?
4:58, I'm sorry.
If it's 4:58, are you familiar with the story involving the defendant and the fact that did you and she discussed her receiving some candy or some underwear or something from Mr. Alexander on February 14th of 2007?
Yes, that she received underwear.
And on that, it's the same day, right?
Yes.
If it's the same day and she's writing these things, if she's received these items and is now writing this, does that impact or does that affect or is it included in one of these symptoms that we've just talked about involving borderline personality disorder?
Can you clarify?
Well, specifically, she's just supposedly is a gift from what you know. Is it a gift, a good thing or a bad thing?
A positive thing?
And then we're talking about what here? Positive or negative things?
Negative.
And so is that something that you see with regard to perhaps unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, or is that not any part of this borderline personality disorder issue?
I would say that I can't make that relation without more information.
Okay. We were about to talk about whether or not you agreed with Dr. Samuels about whether or not this was post-traumatic stress disorder, correct?
Correct.
And you indicated that you disagreed, correct?
Correct.
In terms of this case, did you prepare a report?
I did.
And with regard to the preparation of the report, how is it that you go about preparing it? I understand that you have to prepare the content, but who, in your office, who does the typing?
I do.
And who does the reviewing of the report?
I do.
And so any errors that are there, whose errors are those?
They're mine.
And in this case, with regard to Dr. Samuels, are you familiar with, and I'll show you exhibit number 544, with his conclusion and diagnosis that the defendant, according to him, falls clearly under criteria A1, A2, B3, C3, C6, and D3 for post-traumatic stress disorder. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
If an individual is making that assessment, does that fall short under either C or D for post-traumatic stress disorder?
Objection is characterized as Dr. Samuel's testimony.
Overruled. You may answer.
According to this, it does fall short.
And where does it fall short? Which section?
The number of criteria.
And the criteria are under A, B, C, or D?
It falls short in D, and I'd have to review C to ensure that it falls short.
You indicated that you've reviewed this case and that you disagree that this is post-traumatic stress disorder. I want to talk about your disagreement with Dr. Samuels as to why you believe that this is not a case of post-traumatic stress disorder. So how does that work in terms of the DSM and how you go about making that determination? Can you tell me how that works generally?
Sure. There are four categories of symptoms that we look for that suggest the presence of PTSD.
And these four categories, do you know off the top of your head, for example, what the first category deals with?
It's just the presence of whether the person experienced a traumatic event, that they experienced a strong sense of fear, helplessness, horror as a result of it.
How about the second, if you will, general category? What does that talk about?
The second category pertains to the tendency to re-experience symptoms.
Okay, and the third one, which would be the C, what does that one refer to?
That's referred to as avoidance.
And what does that mean?
The tendency to avoid stimuli, thoughts, anything related to the trauma.
And number 4?
The last one is termed increased arousal. There's a number of symptoms that fall under that.
And what does it mean to have increased arousal as it applies to this particular section of the DSM-4 and PTSD?
It's a change of arousal. For example, a newly developed tendency to become angry, or the tendency to be hypervigilant, which means to be hypersensitive to your environment, looking around, making sure that you're safe, having an exaggerated startle response. If someone walks in the room, your body might jolt in a way that it typically doesn't. Those are some examples.
Under A, if you could tell us again, because you went a little bit quickly on it, what it refers to and whether or not you agree or disagree with Dr. Samuels as to whether or not the defendant meets that criteria.
A is the presence of a traumatic event that,
Go ahead.
that causes a strong sense of horror, fear.
So do you agree or disagree with Dr. Samuels as to that, whether or not the defendant meets it?
Dr. Samuels indicated that she experienced PTSD as a result of the killing.
And so do you agree or disagree with his assessment there?
The way that she describes it, she felt fear for her life. So she would meet criteria for A, yes.
Well, what about the fact that perhaps there was these 2 intruders that came in? If these 2 intruders came in and there's this event, is that the basis for this meeting this criteria?
If that's what he based his diagnosis on, then that would be inaccurate.
And would you then agree that that's, and if you can't meet the first criteria, in other words, if you are basing it, let's assume that it's an event that may or may not have occurred. If it's an event that didn't occur, would that automatically do away with post-traumatic stress disorder?
Objection mischaracterizes Dr. Samuel's testimony.
Overruled, the jury is directed to recall the testimony presented during the trial.
Would that do that?
Yes, because as I highlighted earlier, the symptoms are strongly related to the actual trauma, which is that criteria A that you're referring to.
So if there is no trauma, let's assume in this case, if there are no 2 intruders that came in, hence no trauma, would that then speak against the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder?
Correct.
Objection mischaracterizes testimony.
Overruled.
What was your answer?
Correct.
So does there have to be an actual event that triggers this, or can this post-traumatic stress disorder be based on a made-up event?
It cannot be based on a made-up event.
One of the things that you also indicated was that Dr. Karp also found that there was post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
That's correct.
And with regard to her post-traumatic stress disorder, what were the triggering events?
She indicated that Ms. Arias developed PTSD as a result of the physical abuse that she allegedly endured for Mr. Alexander.
And let's assume that there was no physical abuse. Would that then, in terms of finding post-traumatic stress disorder, would that indicate that yes, the diagnosis was appropriate or not if those events did not occur?
Similar to before, if the event is not true, then the subsequent criteria wouldn't apply.
But if the event involved, you said that if the event involved the killing, and if that's what Dr. Samuels based it on, even though we have this PDS issue, then you would agree with him that it could be an event that triggers this reaction.
I would agree that it would meet the criteria for A.
What about B? What is that again? What are we talking about with regard to B? What is the overall subject of that?
B is re-experiencing, the tendency to think about and relive the experience, the traumatic event.
So what we're talking about with regard to this one is we're talking about re-experience.